At my parents' 30th anniversary, Mom joked, "My sister was in love with my husband." Then his one sentence exposed her affair. The sentence that ended my parents' marriage had 11 words. My husband said them quietly, without raising his voice, without breaking eye contact with my mother. Just 11 words dropped into a room full of champagne flutes and centerpieces and 30 years of careful, practiced lies. 11 words, and I watched my father's face change in real time. I've replayed that moment hundreds of times since. The way the conversations nearby dissolved into static, the way my aunt's hand went to her mouth, the way my mother stopped breathing, not gasped, not stuttered, just stopped, like someone had yanked the power cord out of her chest. I wasn't supposed to be there. We weren't supposed to be there. Ethan and I had agreed, months earlier, that we were done with the whole circus, done with the dinners that always left me hollow, done with the phone calls I dreaded picking up, done with my mother's careful, surgical little cuts disguised as jokes. But my dad had called, just my dad, which was unusual. He'd asked in this tired, quiet voice if we would come, just this once. 30 years, he said. He wanted his whole family there. I should have said no. I should have trusted what 6 years of evidence had already told me. I didn't. You need to understand something about my family before I explain what happened at that party. We looked normal. That's the thing about families like mine. They're experts at looking normal. Christmas card normal, dinner party normal, the kind of normal that makes your friends say your mom is so fun while you stand next to her smiling and quietly dying inside. My parents, Tom and Diane Mercer, had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a success story. Dad owned a mid-size HVAC company in the suburbs of Cincinnati. Mom did volunteer work, joined the right committees, went to the right brunches. Their house had a circular driveway and a sunroom, and one of those kitchens with the marble island where people gather during parties. My sister Haley was 4 years younger than me, and from the moment she arrived, she was different, louder, more electric, the kind of kid who filled a room without trying. I don't say that bitterly. It was simply true, the way some people are. Mom noticed it immediately and made the classic parenting mistake of feeding it. I was the reliable one. Good grades, quiet friends, the kind of kid who cleaned up without being asked. Mom called me her little helper. She didn't mean it as an insult. That was the worst part. Growing up, the comparisons were constant but subtle. Haley was adventurous, which meant I was timid. Haley was spontaneous, which meant I was dull. Haley was magnetic, which meant I was, what? The background? The supporting character in my own family? I learned to take up less space. That was the lesson my childhood taught me. Shrink, accommodate, keep the peace. Then Haley turned 17 and everything reorganized around her survival. She'd been struggling with an eating disorder for almost 2 years before anyone admitted it out loud. When she finally collapsed at school, truly collapsed, ambulance, emergency room, the whole terrifying sequence, our family fractured in a specific way. The crisis became the architecture of everything that followed. Every conflict had to be measured against it. Every truth had to be weighed. Could Haley handle this? That became the operating question, and my mother was the one who controlled the answer. For years after Haley recovered, genuinely recovered, she'd done real work in therapy and gotten healthy, my mother still used the crisis as a management tool. Any pushback against Haley's behavior got routed through that same calculus. Don't push her, Claire. Remember what she went through. As if what Haley had been through was a permanent exemption from accountability, Haley was smart enough to use it. I say that without pleasure. I spent a long time not wanting to see it, because seeing it meant accepting that my sister had made a choice. It's easier to believe people are simply broken than to believe they've learned exactly how to use their brokenness as a weapon. I met Ethan at 26 at a work conference in Columbus that I almost didn't attend. He was presenting on supply chain logistics, and I was there for a panel on operations management, and we ended up arguing, professionally and cheerfully, for 45 minutes over hotel coffee about forecasting models. He called it the best argument he'd ever won. I pointed out that I'd won it. We were married 2 years later. From the beginning, my mother liked him in a specific way I couldn't quite name. The way you like something you want access to. She'd call him separately when she knew I was busy. She'd find excuses to sit next to him at dinners. Small things. The kind of things that, individually, you can explain away. On our wedding day, I was in the bridal suite getting my veil adjusted when my maid of honor, Trish, came in with an expression I didn't understand until years later. "Your mom was talking to Ethan," she said carefully. "For a while. Outside the chapel." "That's fine," I said. She seemed, I don't know, intense. I filed it away. It was my wedding day. I had 1,000 things to manage. I filed it away and walked down the aisle and married the man I loved and tried to believe that the unease I felt was just nerves. It wasn't until Ethan told me, 3 years into our marriage, during a conversation about why he preferred we limit visits to my parents, that I learned what my mother had said to him outside that chapel. She'd asked him if he was sure. Not in the way a loving, almost mother-in-law checks on a nervous groom. Specifically, deliberately. "Are you sure this is what you want? You know Claire's always been the practical one, not the exciting one." He'd looked at her for a long moment, he told me. And then he'd said, "I'm exactly sure." And then he'd walked inside and married me. He'd never told me because he'd known it would hurt me more than it would help. That's the kind of man he is. He sits with information until he understands what to do with it. I've learned from him. Slowly, but I've learned. Haley's behavior around Ethan started almost immediately. We all thought it was just her personality. Big, flirty, boundary loose with everyone. She'd always been physical in how she communicated. Hugs, touches, proximity. The first time I noticed it specifically was Thanksgiving, 2 years after the wedding. Haley was telling a story about a trip she'd taken, and she reached out mid-sentence and put her hand on Ethan's chest, just rested it there, like it was natural, like she'd done it 100 times. Ethan stepped back, almost imperceptibly. I was the only one who saw. I told myself it was nothing. The texts started the following spring. I found out almost by accident. Ethan's phone was on the counter, and a message from Haley came through while he was in the shower. He had nothing to hide. The screen just lit up while I was standing there. Does she even know how lucky she is? I stared at it for a long time. My hands went cold, not shaking, just cold, the way they get when my body processes something before my brain catches up. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone back down and stood very still in my own kitchen and told myself there was probably a context I was missing. When Ethan came in, I showed it to him. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been watching out of the corner of your eye and finally decided you have to address. There are others, he said. He showed me the thread. Not hundreds of messages, she wasn't stupid, but a careful, strategic collection. Things she'd say at 1 a.m. I don't think she really understands you. I feel like we get each other in a way she doesn't. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if things were different. One message sent at 12:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. You deserve someone who sees you, actually sees you. He'd never responded to any of them, not once. He'd screenshotted everything, time-stamped, saved in a folder on his phone labeled with my sister's name. I asked him why he hadn't told me. Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose between me and her, he said. And because I wasn't sure you'd believe me. That last part hit harder than anything Haley had ever sent him. I confronted my mother about it at the time. That was my first mistake, going to my mother instead of going directly to Haley. But Haley had been going through a difficult stretch, struggling with some things in therapy, and I genuinely thought that my mother would be the bridge. She had always positioned herself as the bridge. Oh, Claire, my mother said, with that particular inflection that always preceded something designed to feel kind, but wasn't. Haley's just going through a phase. She doesn't mean anything by it. She looks up to Ethan. She looks up to him at 1 a.m. You're taking it too literally. That's always been your thing, you know. You're so literal. There it was, the pivot. Every real conversation with my mother eventually reached this pivot, the moment where my concern became evidence of my failing. I was too serious, too sensitive, too something. Whatever I was feeling was always, gently, reframed as a character flaw. Mom, she said she wonders what would have happened if things were different. That's not looking up to someone. She has a flair for the dramatic. She always has. It doesn't mean anything. It means something to me. My mother sighed. The patient sigh of someone managing a difficult child. What would you like me to do, Claire? Call her and tell her she can't admire her brother-in-law? She'd be devastated. You know how she gets. Yes, I knew exactly how she got. That was the whole problem. I went home with the screenshots and the same feeling I'd had my entire childhood, like I was standing in a room full of people telling me the ceiling wasn't on fire while smoke poured through the vents. For 2 years after that, Ethan and I created distance. Not a dramatic cutoff, just a slow, deliberate withdrawal. Fewer visits, shorter calls, polite but protected. And then my father called. He sounded different on the phone, older somehow. He said he wanted the family together. He said 30 years was worth celebrating. He asked if I would come. I asked Ethan. Your mother has never been able to resist an audience, he said. He said it without judgment, just as a fact, the way you state weather. I know, I said. Then we go in knowing that. We don't stay more than 2 hours. First sign of anything, we leave. We agreed. We went. The party was held at Carmine's, a private event space in Hyde Park with exposed brick and soft lighting and the kind of floral arrangements that announce a significant occasion. About 40 guests, my parents' closest friends, some extended family, a few neighbors. My mother wore a cream-colored dress and a smile I recognized immediately as her audience smile, the one calibrated for rooms, not people. For the first hour, things were fine. Too fine. The kind of fine that hums with something underneath it. The way the air feels before a storm you can't see yet. I felt it the moment we walked in. My sister was already there, standing near the bar in a red dress, and her eyes found Ethan before they found me. Just for a second. Just long enough. I kept it to myself. Ethan put his hand on my back when we sat down. I felt the warmth of it and breathed. The dinner was good. The speeches were touching. My dad looked happy. Genuinely, simply happy. And for a while, I thought maybe I'd been wrong to brace so hard. My Aunt Linda asked Haley about her love life. It was the kind of question aunts ask at family parties, perfectly innocent. Haley laughed it off. And then my mother leaned forward with her champagne glass and her audience smile and said what she said. I've tried to remember afterward exactly how the words sounded coming out of her mouth. She made them sound playful. She made them sound like a fun little secret she was generously sharing. She made them sound like the kind of harmless family lore that makes everyone laugh and no one actually processes. Haley may not have a boyfriend, but she's had a crush for years. Her sister's husband. She laughed. Isn't that terrible? The table laughed because they didn't know how not to. My aunt tried to pivot. She said something about Ethan having a brother for Haley, and Haley looked up through her lashes with that careful, practiced smile and said, I don't think anyone in his family could compare. That was the moment. Not the texts, not the Thanksgiving, not the wedding day conversation. That moment in front of 40 people with champagne and anniversary flowers on the table. My sister said out loud what she had always said in every other way except out loud, and my mother laughed. I stood up. My chair scraped the marble floor, and 2 nearby tables went quiet. How dare you? My mother's smile froze with precision, the way expensive things break, all at once. Completely. Claire, how dare you sit at your own anniversary dinner and make my marriage a joke for the room? Haley's face drained. It was just, you texted my husband at 1 in the morning to tell him I didn't understand him. I wasn't shouting. I was something worse than shouting. I was clear. You touched his chest at Thanksgiving. You asked him if he ever wondered what life would look like with someone more exciting. My aunt made a sound. Several other people went very still. Ethan stood up beside me, not in front of me, beside me. That's the detail I'll never forget. My mother hissed, "You're making a scene." You made the scene, I said. I'm just refusing to die quietly in it. My father slammed his palm on the table. Sit down, both of you. I sat down for 34 years. I looked at him, at my father, who I loved, who I had always wanted to protect. I sat down when you let Haley use her pain to manage this whole family. I sat down when Mom asked Ethan on our wedding day, both of you. I sat down for 34 years. I looked at him, at my father, who I loved, who I had always wanted to protect. I sat down when you let Haley use her pain to manage this whole family. I sat down when Mom asked Ethan on our wedding day whether he was sure he wanted to marry me. The room temperature dropped. Dad looked at Mom, just briefly, just for a second. I am done sitting down. Haley shot to her feet, and her champagne glass tipped over and spread across the white tablecloth like something blooming. You think you're so perfect, she said. Her voice was shaking. You've always thought you were better than me. No, Haley, I think I'm married, and I think you're 30 years old enough to stop treating my husband like something our mother forgot to give you. She looked at Ethan then, directly, completely, with the kind of desperation that strips everything off a person and leaves them bare in front of a room full of witnesses. I loved you, she said. I loved you before she even deserved you. Silence. Not the polite kind, the airless kind, where everyone understands that something has shifted permanently, and no one knows how to move inside it. No, I said. You didn't love him. You built a fantasy because this family taught you that wanting something was the same as being owed it. Don't you dare speak to her that way. My mother was on her feet. You have no idea what she's been through. I know exactly what she's been through, I said. And I also know what she's put other people through. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Mom. She can have survived something and still have caused harm. She can have recovered and still have spent 6 years trying to dismantle my marriage. She's fragile, my mother said, and the word came out automatic. The same word she'd used for 15 years. The same word that had always ended conversations. She's not fragile, I said. She's dangerous. And so are you. That word, dangerous, did something to the room. A few people shifted. Someone set down their glass. Haley started crying. Big, immediate, practiced tears. The kind she'd learned young. The ones that always made people reach for her and step back from me. My mother leaned forward. This is exactly why we don't provoke her, Claire. This is— And then Ethan spoke. He had been silent for the last 4 minutes, standing beside me, steady and still. He looked at my mother the way you look at something you've been patient about for a very long time. Diane, he said. Just her name. Just her name in that voice, and the room got quiet all over again. You seem very comfortable joking about inappropriate crushes. He paused. So tell me something. The pause he let sit after that was the longest few seconds of my life. Was Greg Lawson just a harmless crush too? My mother stopped breathing. The table stopped moving. The ambient noise of the room, the glasses, the music from somewhere near the bar, the low hum of nearby conversations, all of it seemed to recede. My father turned his head, slowly, completely. He turned and looked at my mother. 30 years of marriage folded into one look. What is he talking about? My father said. Greg Lawson. I hadn't heard that name in years. He had been a neighbor, briefly, when I was in high school. The kind of man who played golf on Saturdays and had a loud laugh and wore the right kind of watch. He and my mother had been on the same neighborhood association committee. They'd organized a block party together one summer. He'd moved away when I was 16 or 17. I'd never thought about him. Ethan had. He told me later, that night, sitting in our car in our own driveway, unable to go inside yet, how he'd found out. It had been 2 years ago, a conversation with my Uncle Paul at a family cookout. My uncle had too much beer and said something offhand, something he clearly assumed Ethan already knew, something about my mother and Greg and the summer my father had extended a work trip. Ethan had listened and he had not reacted, and he had gone home and looked up Greg Lawson, who had been married when he lived in our neighborhood. Greg Lawson, who had moved, somewhat suddenly, to Phoenix in the fall of 2008. Greg Lawson, who had divorced his wife the following year. Ethan hadn't told me. He'd told me, that night in the driveway, that he'd been waiting. Not for revenge, he said. For the right moment, if a moment ever came. For the moment when my mother escalated to a point where I needed backup that she couldn't dismiss or reframe. I didn't want to put it in your hands, he said. I didn't want you carrying that. I didn't know how to feel about that for a long time. I still don't. entirely. At the table, in the silence that followed his question, my mother found her composure again. You have to understand how good she was at this. How many years she had spent becoming fluent in composure. It only took a few seconds. I have no idea what you're implying, she said quietly, with precise dignity. My father was still looking at her. Ethan, she said, I don't know where you heard whatever you've heard, but this is not the— Dad asked me a question, Ethan said. He wasn't looking at my mother anymore. He was looking at my father. I think you should let him ask it again. My father asked it again. Not loudly. Very quietly, actually. In a way that was somehow worse than shouting. Diane, what is he talking about? My mother looked at her husband, then at the room, then at her hands. And that was the answer. Not words. The absence of them. The 2 seconds where she could have laughed it off, denied it convincingly, produced the right response, and didn't. Couldn't. After 30 years of composure, her composure picked that night to fail her. My father stood up from the table. He didn't make a speech. He didn't cry. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, folded it over his arm, looked at my mother one more time, and walked toward the exit. My Aunt Linda said his name. He didn't stop. The room fractured into smaller conversations after that, the polite chaos of people trying to process something they were not equipped to process in public. Haley had stopped crying. She was sitting very still with a hollow expression. The fantasy she'd been sustaining for 6 years suddenly competing with a reality she hadn't anticipated. My mother sat in her chair and looked at the centerpiece. I stood there for a moment and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just tiredness. The long, complicated tiredness of someone who has been braced for a very long time and is only now, finally, allowed to stop. Ethan took my hand. We found my father outside, sitting on a bench near the valet stand, still holding his jacket. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. He looked like someone who had just been handed information that was rewriting his entire internal map of the last 30 years. I sat down beside him. We didn't talk for a long time. I should have protected you better, he finally said. He wasn't talking about the party. Dad, from all of it. The way things were. I saw it. I didn't want to see it, but I saw it. I took his hand. His hand was cold from the night air. We have time, I said. He nodded slowly. I don't know if he believed me. I wasn't sure I believed me either, but it felt like the right thing to offer. In the weeks that followed, the architecture of what had happened became clearer. My father moved into the guest room of his own house for 3 weeks, then got an apartment across town on the east side of Cincinnati, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with a view of a park he said reminded him of nothing in particular, which seemed to be the point. He hired a divorce attorney, Marcus Webb of Webb & Associates, a man I met once in a conference room at a building downtown, and found to be quiet, thorough, and utterly without theatrics. He had the handshake of someone who had heard everything and been surprised by none of it, which was what my father needed. My father didn't want drama. He'd had enough drama to last him. The divorce moved forward without the hostility I'd braced for. My mother, it turned out, didn't fight much. I think she understood on some level that the cost of fighting would be exposure, that any contested proceeding might surface things she preferred to keep filed away. So she was cooperative, which is a word that means very different things in different contexts. In this context, it meant she accepted the terms my father's attorney proposed with minimal counter-offers and signed the papers in February. I saw her once, between the party and the signing. She was leaving the grocery store near her house, and I was driving by, and we made eye contact through my windshield for a second. She was carrying a single paper bag. She looked smaller than I remembered her. I kept driving. My mother called me twice in those months. The first time, she tried to reframe everything. She was remarkably composed, actually, in the way she's always been when she's repackaging something. She said my father had taken things out of context. She said Ethan had implied things he couldn't prove. She said the party had become a spectacle that none of them had wanted, and that she hoped we could all find a way to move past it. I asked her if she had anything she wanted to say about what she'd done. The line went quiet for a long time. I think, she said finally, in the careful voice of a woman who spent a lifetime choosing words, that I have made mistakes, like every person does. But I don't think this is the way to process them. The second call was the apology. Not for the things she'd done, for upsetting me. There's a specific type of apology that is actually just a request to stop being upset, and I'd had 34 years of practice recognizing it. The tell is the preposition. Sorry for something is accountability. Sorry that something happened to you is performance. I didn't return the third call. Haley texted me about 6 weeks after the party. The message was long, 4 paragraphs, and started with the word obviously, which told me everything I needed to know about whether she'd actually processed anything. The tone was wounded in the way I recognized from our whole lives together. The wound positioned first, so that whatever came next landed inside the frame of her pain, rather than inside the frame of what she'd actually done. I read it twice. I thought about what I would have to become to respond to it productively right then. I set my phone down and didn't respond. I haven't responded. Maybe I will someday. Maybe when enough time has passed that the conversation can happen without the weight of the party party underneath every word. Her therapist, she's been seeing someone for years, a woman named Dr. Renata Solis who specializes in family systems, someone Haley herself found and chose, which matters. Her therapist apparently reached out to mine through the proper channels to ask if I'd consider a facilitated session down the line. My therapist, Sandra Park, mentioned it at the end of a session and said it was entirely my choice. I told Sandra I'd think about it. That's where it stands. Or maybe the door just closed. I'm learning to hold that as a legitimate possibility, that some doors, when they close for reasons that don't require further examination. What I know now, that I didn't know clearly enough before. My mother spent 30 years managing a family the way a director manages a production. She curated the narrative. She assigned the roles. She controlled who the audience saw as sympathetic and who they were meant to dismiss. I was always in the background because the background is where directors put people they don't want competing with the main story. She had fed Haley's obsession with Ethan, not deliberately maybe, but with the same casual negligence with which she'd done most of the damage in her life. An offhand comment, a laugh at the wrong moment, 30 years of telling Haley that wanting things entitled her to things, and of telling me that my discomfort was a failing of imagination. What I know about my sister is more complicated. She had done real damage. The texts were real. The behavior was real. The words at the table were real. None of that stops being true because she'd also genuinely survived something hard at 17. People contain both. I'm working on learning to hold that without using one to cancel the other. What I know about my father is that he is a quieter, simpler person than the situation produced, and that he deserved better, and that 30 years is a long time to carry something you weren't sure you were allowed to name. He calls me on Sundays now. Sometimes we talk for an hour, sometimes 15 minutes. He's taken up woodworking again, something he'd dropped decades ago. He brought a small box he'd made to our house for my birthday. It's on my desk right now. What I know about Ethan is this. He sat with information for 2 years because he trusted me to find my own way through the hard parts first, and he held the backup ready for the moment I needed it without knowing in advance whether that moment would ever come. I've never been more certain I married the right person. People ask me sometimes, friends who know the broad strokes, if I regret going to the party. It's a reasonable question. The fallout was enormous. My parents' marriage ended. My relationship with my mother is for now over. My relationship with my sister is for now suspended in a kind of waiting. But here's what I know. None of what happened at Carmine's on a Saturday night in October started there. It had been building for decades. The party was just the room where it finally became visible to everyone at the same time. Some fires burned quietly for years, ended in a kind of waiting. But here's what I know. None of what happened at Carmine's on a Saturday night in October started there. It had been building for decades. The party was just the room where it finally became visible to everyone at the same time. Some fires burned quietly for years. They take out structures you didn't know were compromised until the walls fall. I didn't set this fire. I just stopped pretending I couldn't smell the smoke. My father finished the divorce in February. The morning the papers were signed, he called me. He sounded tired, the way people sound when something enormous and long anticipated is finally over. Not happy exactly. Lighter. You know what the strange thing is, he said. What? I think I've known for a long time, on some level. And I kept not knowing it. Does that make sense? Yes, I said. I don't know whether to be angry at myself for that. I know the feeling, I said. He was quiet for a moment. That box I made you, he said. I want to make you something bigger. A chest, maybe. Something you could actually use. I told him I would love that. Good, he said. And then, after a pause, I'm glad you went to that party, Claire. I held the phone and looked out the window at nothing in particular. Yeah, I said. I think I am too.